When I was a kid, I read a lot. I used to come to the public library in Washington near us and get out a stack of books, take them home, and then bring them back the next week. And the children's librarian at my public library, Mrs. Carney, was really instrumental in, she'd save aside a book every week, and she'd get me to, when I bring it back, she'd ask me about it. So books became my blood. And that made me think, I want books in my life always, so I'm either going to be a writer or a librarian.
Such a pleasure to be here. I always like events in this space, and a great pleasure to continue my conversation with Tracy. I had the great pleasure of interviewing her this afternoon on the radio, and I read the book myself, so I can tell you, if you haven't read it yet, what a treat you have in store for you. Before we get started, let's just sort of set the ground. I mean, Greg sort of explained the broad strokes that you've reimagined Othello set in a 1970s Washington schoolyard. Can you sort of expand a little bit and sort of set the scene for the book?
Sure. Well, the reason I did it was because Hogarth Press has this project called the Shakespeare Project, and they've asked various writers to take a Shakespeare play and write a novel inspired by it. And various writers have done this, including Ann Tyler, Margaret Atwood, Howard Jacobson, Jeanette Winterson. And when they asked me, I immediately thought it was a really fascinating idea. And, I'm normally a historical novelist, and I do a whole lot of research. And the thought of being given a story and characters seemed so strange, and I just thought, I want to do that. I always like to take risks and try different things. So I chose Othello, not really knowing why at first, but it kind of came clearer to me that I myself, I like stories about outsiders and how we treat people who are different from ourselves. And Othello seemed to fit that very well. And then I was at a party and someone said, "Why did you choose Othello? Are you particularly interested in issues of race and discrimination?" And I said, well, not sort of like consciously, but actually I grew up in an integrated neighborhood in Washington, D.C., and I went to a school that was mostly black. And so I had the experience for several years of being, my skin color was different from most of the people around me, and at least at school. And maybe that was why I chose it. And then we kept talking, and I said, actually, I could imagine setting Othello on a school playground because you've got your quintessential, you've got the new boy, the new kid who walks onto the playground is different from everybody else, and you've got the most popular girl, and you've got the bully in Iago, and suddenly it all clicked, and I thought, I liked the idea of the playground as this kind of microcosm for the outer world but controlled by kids by and large. So it all seemed to make sense. So that's what and then I thought, well, I want to set it, I want the kids to be not teenagers, not high school, which is what you'd expect, but they're too young. I don't want them really young, like 5 years old. That would be really hard. But 11 is the perfect age because they're not quite teenagers, but they're starting to imitate how adults, the adult world, and so that's why I chose to make it 6th grade when they're 11 years old. And I thought, okay, if that's the case, I'm gonna set it in 1974 when I was 11, because then I can reference all of the stuff that I did. So that's what I did.
All right, before we talk more, there's so much that you mentioned there that I want to unpack a little bit more. But probably a lot of people here haven't read the book yet, so maybe you can just give them a little taste, set the scene just a little.
I'm going to stand because I always do, and actually I might just stand here. Is this all right? Yeah, because the podium's a bit, teacherly, and I'm definitely not teacherly. So I'm going to start from the very beginning, and you can all hear me all right. Yeah, let's see. Good. Okay. Dee noticed him before anyone else. She was glad of that, held on to it. It made her feel special to have him to herself for a few seconds, before the world around them skipped a beat and did not recover for the rest of the day. The playground was busy before school. Enough children had arrived early that games of jacks and kickball and hopscotch had begun, to be abandoned when the bell rang. Dee herself had not been early. Her mother had sent her upstairs to change her top for something looser. Dee had to run her partway to school, braids thumping against her back, until the stream of students heading the same direction reassured her she was not late. She had gotten to the playground with a minute to spare before the first bell rang. There hadn't been enough time to join her friends jumping double dutch, so instead, Dee had headed to the playground entrance into the building, where Mr. Brabant was standing with the other teachers, waiting for the class lines to form. Her teacher had a short, angled haircut that squared his head and stood very straight. Someone told Dee he had fought in Vietnam. Dee was not the top student in class. That prize went to prim Patty. But she liked to please Mr. Brabant when she could, enough to make him notice her, though she knew she was sometimes called a teacher's pet. She took her place at the front of the line now and looked around, her eyes on the double Dutch girls still jumping rope. Then she spotted him, a motionless presence by the merry-go-round. 4 boys were spinning on it, Ian and Rod and 2 boys from 4th grade. They were going so fast that Dee was sure one of the teachers would stop them. The boy was standing near the frenetic motion, was not dressed like the other boys, casual in their jeans and t-shirts and sneakers. Instead, he wore gray flared pants, a white short-sleeved shirt, and black shoes, like a uniform a private school student would wear. But it was his skin that stood out, its color reminding Dee of bears she'd seen at the zoo a few months before on a school field trip. Though they were called black bears, their fur was actually deep brown with reddish tint at the tips. The new boy was not watching the merry-go-round, but studying the L-shaped building. It was a typical suburban elementary school built 8 years before and looked like 2 red brick shoeboxes unimaginatively shoved together. When Dee had started kindergarten, it still had a new building smell to it. Now, though, it was like a dress she had worn many times, with its tears and stains and marks where the hem had been let down. She knew every classroom, every staircase, every handrail, every bathroom cubicle. She knew every foot of the playground, too. Dee had fallen off the swings, torn her tights on the slide, gotten stuck at the top of the jungle gym. She had lived her life on the playground, laughed and cried, and had crushes and formed friendships and made few enemies. It was her world, so familiar she took it for granted. Now someone new and different had entered the territory, and this made Dee look at the space anew and suddenly find it shabby, and herself an alien in it, like him. He was moving now. Not like a bear with its bulky, lumbering gait, more like a wolf or a panther. Whatever he was thinking, probably about being the new boy, in a playground full of strangers the opposite color from him, he padded toward the school doors where the teachers waited with the unconscious assuredness of someone who knows how his body works. Dee felt her chest tighten. She drew in a breath. "Well, well," Mr. Brabant remarked. "I think I hear drums." Miss Lode, the other 6th grade teacher standing next to him, tittered. "Where did Mrs. Duke say he's from?" "Guinea, I think. Or is it Nigeria? Africa, anyway." He's yours, isn't he? Better you than me." Miss Lode smoothed her skirt and touched her earrings, perhaps to make sure they were still there. It was a nervous habit she repeated often. Mr. Brabant shrugged. "I don't foresee problems." No, of course not." Miss Lode kept her wide blue eyes fixed on her colleague, as if not wanting to miss any morsel of wisdom that might help her to become a better teacher. "Do you think we should, say something to the students about him? About him being different, to encourage them, to welcome him?" "Take off your kid gloves, Diane. He doesn't need any special treatment just because he's a new boy. Thank you.
I think even hearing you read that, again, I had the same feeling as I did reading the book, which is such a clear sense of memory of my own children's time in a schoolyard, much like that,
Right.
with a pirate ship type structure and all the
What about your
staples,
own
but
time?
my own as
Yeah.
well. And I wondered for you the significance of, I mean, in that party that you described when you said, oh,
Yeah.
maybe a schoolyard would be good, because you did have your own memories of feeling like
Yeah.
an outsider when you were in 5th grade and so on. But tell me a bit more about the significance and the opportunity for a writer setting a story like this in a schoolyard.
Well, in a lot of ways, for one thing, it's a real shortcut to readers because we have all been in school, and all of us, we may not have been new on the playground, but you all remember new kids on the playground, and even if not that, if you've not been a new kid, there are times when you're ostracized by your friends, or something goes wrong and you're kind of out of sorts with everyone else. And it was that feeling I wanted to draw on. And I knew that it was understood by readers. So that made it, in some ways, a lot easier to start with. But it also, I feel like the school playground is this kind of, I think I said earlier, it was like a microcosm of the wider world. But it's also a time when, for 11-year-olds, they're trying to find their way. They're trying to become adults.
Well, and they're in 6th grade, so
Yeah.
as you even described there, she's been around, she knows every inch of the playground,
Yeah.
and they are taking off
Yeah.
to adulthood imminently.
And they're the big fish. They rule the playground. All the other kids are younger. They've been around a long time. They're kind of bored with school, and they're ready to move on, but they're scared because they're moving up to junior high school, which they know they'll suddenly be the little fish and have less power and less control. And it's this liminal period of movement when they feel confident, but they're also worried as well. And there's something very intense about playground life and all of the allegiances and the battles that go on. And I thought it seemed to be a good place to set a story like this. I also felt, in order to kind of rack up the tension a bit, I thought I'm going to set it, the structure, the same as Othello in that there are 5 acts, but I'm going to have it take place over the course of one day. And so it starts, the first act is before school, and then it's morning recess, lunch, afternoon recess, and after school. And and so it's very tightly structured, and it all happens like.
Why did you want to do that?
I thought I wanted to set some limitations, and I also thought things happen fast for kids. The other thing is that Othello, the play, starts with Othello and Desdemona have already gotten married. And so you don't hear anything about the development of their relationship except for them explaining it. They tell somebody else, this is what happened to us. And I thought, I'm not sure the stakes are high enough in a novel at any rate. I mean, a play is told in a very different way from a novel, but I wanted people to really to care about this relationship, to care about Osei. His name is Osei, her name is Dee. And in order to do that, you kind of have to be there from the start. And I thought, well, the thing about 11-year-olds is that things move fast. So when my son was 11, in his last year of school, before he went to big school in London, there was this period over about a course of a week where suddenly all the kids in his year started getting boyfriends and girlfriends for about 15 minutes. And it was, so you'd hear that like morning recess, 2 people would get together, which involved them standing side by side, looking embarrassed, looking over at their friends, being teased, and then at lunchtime they'd split up. And that was, yes, I know. And I thought, this can actually work over the course of a day. It might not work if they were in high school, but it definitely works when they're 11.
Oh no, it's just another one of the aspects that stirred so many memories. We all remember falling in love with someone across a crowded playground.
Yeah.
And you really tap into that. So, okay, so you've got this this idea from the publisher, to adapt Othello. You've got your setting in mind. Right. So what, and all the possibilities that it affords you. I'm curious about how, it's so different from the work that you do when you, as a writer of historical, deeply researched novels where the characters are born out of you diving deep into the time and place that you've researched. You know the characters, you know what happens, you know the plot turns, you know how it ends. I mean, so what happens next for you in terms of trying to create? You've got your setting, and you know the path you have to take. So now what do you do?
Well, it was really strange because I actually thought I better do some research. I mean, first of all, I reread Othello, and then I reread it again. So I read it twice, and then I set it aside, and I went to the British Library because that's what I always do as a historical novelist. I start doing my research, and I thought I better do some research. So I got a couple books out, critical studies of Othello, and I read them over the course of a couple of days. And then I really vividly remember returning them to the desk and then looking at the computer terminal where you can go on and order books. And I looked at it and I thought, what shall I order now? I don't really have to. There's no more research to do. And I was terrified because I thought, I actually have to start writing. And I've only been thinking about this thing for a few days. And it was the strangest experience because normally I spend a good 6 months doing research, taking notes, talking to people, going places. And while I'm doing the research, the characters start forming in my head. And some of the story. And by the time I actually sit down to start writing the novel, I know what they sound like. I know what color hair they have. Even if I haven't written any notes on them down, I kind of know. I often know their name. And the first few scenes, at least, I have a sense of the arc of the story. And this time, all of that was kind of provided for me. And it made it feel a little bit like an intellectual exercise to start with. And I thought, oh boy, this is going to be, I'm used to Tracy novels like coming from my gut. So how am I going to get the gut out? But then when I started writing and I started thinking about, I started setting up the playground in my mind, remembering the playground I had been on. I sort of used it but modified it. And then I started thinking, the first thing, one of the first scenes is the girls are playing double dutch, and I thought, okay, what were the chants we used to do? And I started thinking of them and looking some up, and then, bit by bit, I started, I was talking about all kinds of stuff came up about what kind of lunchbox you have and the kind of clothes you wear and the sort of brand of bubble gum and what you eat at the school cafeteria, and all of that stuff came out, so that made it feel much more like me. And then there are some little things when you read it, you'll have some special knowledge here. Two things that I definitely completely experienced in my school days that I would never have thought up otherwise. One of them is that we had a flagpole in front of the school, and when I was in 6th grade, they always chose a couple of girls to be responsible for putting up the flag and taking it down at the end of the day. And we really took advantage of this privilege. So we'd go out there, mess around, and put it up, take it down. And anytime I don't know about the Canadian flag, but the American flag, if it's raining, it's not supposed to be up in the rain. So it would start raining, and we'd say to the teacher, Miss Davis, I have to go out and take the flag down. And we'd take the flag down, and one time it got so wet, I took it home at lunchtime and dried it in the dryer. And one time we accidentally forgot and left it up overnight, and I had to tell some friend who lived right near school and ask her to go take it down. So we took it seriously, but we used to play around it. And there's a scene in New Boy where Ian, the school bully, goes out with Mimi, who's Dee's friend and is also his girlfriend. They go to put the flag up or take it down because it's starting to rain, and he takes the end of the rope and wraps it around his arms, and he goes running out and swings around the flagpole. And we used to do that all the time. It was great. Yeah. So that was one thing. And the other thing that was lifted directly from my childhood are a pair of dashiki pants. Okay, so it was the 70s, right? And actually, I wore them my first day at junior high school, and they were these blue pants that had a dashiki pattern all down the side. Oh boy! And I wore them to school, and my junior high school was I'd say my elementary school was about maybe 85% black, and my junior high school was like 95% black. And I walked onto the playground wearing these, and there was just this kind of wah. And later, when I made friends, my friends later on said, "Oh yeah, you were the girl who wore the tablecloth pants to school the first day." And I thought, so I have a little reference to dashiki pants in the. So there are bits of me in there, and I think that made it more coming from my gut.
And can you tell the story? You mentioned this today on the radio, but how your experience being different. Well, being the minority, but also you had the awareness, even as an 11-year-old, or 10, I guess you were in 5th grade, that you were a minority in this school, and yet you were still part of the majority in greater society.
Yeah.
But so I wanted to ask you about that, but also the story you told about the hair.
Yeah, it was when we used to line up to go out of the classroom, waiting for the bell. So the bell would ring and we'd go out to recess or leave. We'd all line up, and if there was a boy would never do this, but if a girl was standing behind me, sometimes she would start to touch my hair because she's curious, because it's so different from black hair, and I would just stand there and let her do that, but I never did it. I never touched black girls' hair because I just sort of knew. I don't know why I knew. I just knew that was not the thing I was allowed to do. And it was an interesting experience because although I was a minority, I would say my experience is different from Ose's in the book because he is a minority in school and he's a minority in the wider society. And I, even at that age, I knew I might have been a minority in school, but I was still the majority in the wider society, and that makes my experience slightly different.
Another thing you mentioned today is that, in a way, the play Othello is Iago's story. And he really, I mean, perhaps everybody has their favorite or least favorite Shakespearean villain. I always think of him as, he takes the prize. I don't know why. For me, reading Shakespeare always, Iago burned me up the most. And you captured him so well. Again, in a character that, it's in a way just setting these characters in such a universal space as a school yard and school classrooms that we've all related to. You see how we've all known a schoolyard bully or whatever. Tell me a little bit more about what that character was like to work with.
Whenever I saw an Othello production, and I've seen quite a lot over the years, I always felt that Othello is really Iago's play rather than Othello's play. It's a far more interesting part to play than Othello, or you could actually say Othello's a harder part to play because his change is so drastic. But Iago is probably fun to play because he's so ridiculously manipulative, and you just think, how does he do it? And so there's this very famous scene midway through the third act where Iago is standing with Othello and he says something like, don't like that. And Othello goes, what? And he's like, oh, nothing, it's nothing. And he says, no, it must be something. What is it? And I don't really want to say. And no, what is it? And he just slowly reels him in, says, oh, your wife is flirting with that guy. I saw that. And and then by the end of the scene, he's saying they're sleeping together, and Othello's furious and totally takes the bait, and it's just fascinating to watch. And I felt like with New Boy, though, this isn't really Ian's story. It's all of their stories. It's not Osei's story either. It's everybody's. It's a picture of a community and how a community responds to somebody who's different. And so the book, each act, it's actually quite tightly structured, even though you may not realize it at the time. Each act looks over the shoulder of one of 4 characters. So there's Osei, who's a Ghanaian boy whose father's a diplomat. They moved to Washington, D.C., and he goes to school here. And then there's Ian, who's the school bully. And then there's Dee, who's the most popular girl, who takes a shine to Osei and he to her. And then there's Mimi, who is Dee's best friend and is going with Ian. And each act, you look over one shoulder. There's 10 pages of story or however long, and then you go to the next one and another one, and you do that each. So you get this very rounded sense of it's not a book told just about the majority who are either casually racist or very deliberately racist or don't know what they are, and you also come from the side of the victim, of the oppressed, of the minority and their experience of this. So it's less about Iago and Othello and more about all of the kids. And also underlying all that are the adults. So the teachers come in, but they don't say too much. You hear them saying, like you hear at what I read, these kind of remarks that are made, and the kids hear this stuff and they pick up on it, and it's about where does this kind of treatment of somebody's different, where do you get the cues to do that? And you get them from your parents and from your figures of authority like teachers. So they have the teachers play a very small but very important role in the book.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, but you described it well. Tell me what you think we get from adaptations, reimaginings. I mean, there have been films and reinterpretations of all kinds of Shakespeare, including Othello.
Yeah.
None like this. But tell me what you think. What do we get from an interpretation, a reimagining?
Well, one of the things when I first was asked to do this project, take part in the project, I was a little bit worried about taking on Shakespeare. I mean, why would anybody do that? Because he's held up as this kind of figure, and then I thought, well, Shakespeare has stolen this story from an Italian story in the 16th century. He often borrowed other stories, and he wrote a play, and a play is meant to be produced, and produced in many different ways. And so there have been loads of productions of Othello that do all sorts of different things. It might be in period dress, it could be in modern dress. I saw an Othello a couple of years ago in which Iago is also black. Now, get your head around that, which was amazing, because a lot of the things that Iago said, the sort of racist stuff he says in the play, when you have a black actor saying it was like a really bizarre form of self-hatred, and also there was a bond between Othello and Iago which made the betrayal even more painful. So it was a fascinating thing, and I thought, since there's this openness of interpretation that Shakespeare himself meant that there would be, that it was okay for me to do this. What I didn't try to do was replicate the language, and none of the writers in the Shakespeare Project have tried to do this. I mean, we know better than to try to imitate or counter or come up with our own form of poetry or creating words or all the metaphors Shakespeare used. I just stayed away from that, so I stuck with the story. But I thought, since I'm setting it in a modern time, does this actually hold together? Is there a relevance? Is there a universality that actually holds from a play that was written in the 16th century? Does it still resonate now? And boy, does it ever. And that was what was so surprising, because it's very easy to trot out that, it's almost, it becomes a kind of catechism of, oh yeah, Shakespeare is so universal and it works all the time. And this is, working on this for a year made me realize, yeah, this one really does work, and it forces us to think about our own, what we would be in a situation like that, and what do we say or do, whether casually or deliberately, that we need to think about. So that I think is what made it valuable to do.
Do you think you could have set it in a modern day, like a contemporary schoolyard? I mean, in that there's, in many schools, a lot more diversity now. And yet perhaps no less discrimination in certain cases. But I wondered about, did you think about how this scenario might apply to a contemporary?
I thought about setting it now, and for a couple of reasons I didn't. One, which was very pragmatic, is I thought, oh boy, if I start trying to get down with the kids, with the language now and the slang, and I'm just going to get crucified by any teenager who reads this is just going to go, oh, you don't know anything. And I thought it's actually safer to set it when I know. And the other reason is that it's having a little distance, a little cushion of history, I think allows the readers to not feel quite so much like I'm banging you over the head with this and making it into this finger wagging. It's more, and I myself, because I'm a historical writer, I've often felt like I have the cushion of history that allows me to be more playful or to try out things that I might not otherwise. So I've written a lot of different types of characters, 17th century Dutch servants and 15th century tapestry weavers and early 20th century suffragettes. And because none of the readers now have lived back in those times, they don't kind of own them and so nobody really knows exactly what a 17th century Dutch servant painted by Vermeer is going to be like. And so people didn't question that, so I could do it, and there's this kind of cushion. And I think to set New Boy now would remove that cushion and make it all the more like in your face. And I think that just having that little bit of distance and also the personal experience really helped.
For people who, it's no secret that Othello ends badly for most of the characters involved, as a lot of Shakespeare, as it's a tragedy. How did you, I don't want to give away the ending because you do it so well, but I'm curious with something I assume you must have struggled with or grappled with as you were writing, knowing that, in the original play, Othello
bodies everywhere. Yeah.
What's that? Yeah, bodies everywhere. Othello murders his wife. Yeah. You can't, and you're thinking, how do I register the degree of tragedy that's required for this story to do it justice, and yet
not necessarily have the playground littered with
dead 11-year-olds.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I was very aware of that as a potential problem from the start, and I had to just when you're writing and you're creating a world, after a while you get a sense of that world's, like, the boundaries of it and how far you can go, and what makes sense within that world in terms of extremes. And I had to trust myself that I would find a way to do that. And
so you didn't know as you were going, you just trusted that you'd figure it out.
I was thinking through, part of me thought, if I did set it now, then I could have the kids the deaths be sort of social media deaths, so that you get unfriended on Facebook, or you just get, or you get a text, a photo, a horrible photo of you sent around to everyone. Or there are a lot of very modern ways I could have done it, but this is 1974, so I couldn't do all of that. But I thought, in some ways, like what's an equivalent of a death for a kid is like a social death. So I won't say who, but I was trying to figure out how I could use that. And there are things that are really painful for kids that don't have to mean be a mortal blow, but it can feel like a death to them. And so that's the way I went.
How do you feel about going back to presumably your next book? Will be, not adapting a classic. How does that feel? How different is it to go back to? Do you relish the idea of getting back to creating this, composing and structuring the storyline, or how do you feel about that?
Well, it was kind of a relief, because I know where I am with not having a story. Oddly, it sounds as odd as that sounds. It was a huge relief to go back to the British Library and start taking notes and I could feel my characters. I have the next book is going to be set at Winchester Cathedral, which is just in a city called Winchester, south of London, about an hour. And it's the cathedral, apart from having a song that sings about it, it's where Jane Austen is buried. And there are a lot of stories, wonderful stories about that cathedral from various different centuries. And I always knew I wanted to write a cathedral novel, because I just find cathedrals this enclosed atmosphere, enclosed society, and the idea of building something that huge to God and what that actually means, and faith and stuff. So I thought, I'm going to set one, but which story am I going to do? And so you'd think I would do something obvious like Jane Austen, or it was built on a very swampy foundation, and in the early 20th century, it started literally about to fall over, and they got a diver, this guy named William Walker, in this big old huge diving suit, and he dived for 5 years solo, propped up the foundations with sandbags, 70,000 sandbags and blocks of breeze blocks, and that's why the cathedral's still standing. And I thought, man, there's a novel there. But when I went looking at all of this stuff, I always end up going for the least obvious. So I was in the library looking at this. There's this display about the embroidery that had been done in the cathedral in the 1930s. This group of volunteer women, led by these two women, had designed and embroidered these hundreds of gorgeous cushions and kneelers for the choir stalls of the cathedral, and they're still in use. Really beautiful, really unusual. They bring amazing color to that space. And I thought, man, I bet there was a lot of petty politics went on in that volunteer group. As you could just imagine it, and then, so I thought, I'm going to write about that. And so I started researching and found some really surprising things. And the other thing is that after World War I, there was a surplus of women, 2 million more women than men, and they were called surplus women by the newspapers, and so they ended up not marrying, even if they wanted to. And so my heroine, Violet, is one of those. But it started out as a kind of satire, and now it's becoming much darker. But because it's also set in 1932 to 34, and it's about. In the background is the rise of fascism in Germany, and over the last several months, I have heard 1930s fascism referenced so many times, given the current political situation in the States, that I thought, this is becoming somewhat more relevant than I had realized. So for me, going back to all of that, there's this feeling of, I know where I am with this, whereas with New Boy, it was much more, even though the stories provided for me, it wasn't the way I was used to doing it. So, but I don't regret doing it. I feel like I always like to take risks. I don't want to be one of those writers who just churns out the same old type of book all the time. I want to shake myself up. I want to shake you up a little bit too. And I think that it gave me a freshness. It refreshed me in a way that I will always be delighted for. And even just to the point of like figuring out the cover. The publisher does that, and the 3 publishers have come up with 3 completely different covers. But taking part in those conversations, I was thinking, this is so different from a historical cover. Like, imagine a historical novel. You just know what's going to be on a cover. It's always a certain type. And this is not a historical cover at all. None of the 3 is. And I thought, yeah, it's so much more open and lively. I want to bring some of that to my cover talk when we do a historical cover, because there's absolutely no reason why a historical novel shouldn't have a really cover instead of the period painting on the cover, that you know. So it's that sort of like that sort of freshness that I want to bring to the whole experience.